Hi, my name is Frederick Rosen, and I created and built Ticketmaster, and today I'm running another company that's in a different business. Ticketmaster really started as an inventory control system. Basically, if you go back to the early 80s, which is when I got involved, I think I became the CEO of a very little ticket company in 1982. It primarily provided, which is hard to believe in terms of 2006 sensibilities, season ticketing, single ticketing, which meant box office and outlets, all on one integrated system. That did not happen in those days. And phones were just beginning to happen outside New York, and the internet was non-existent. So in those days, what Ticketmaster could do was basically provide a box office inventory system essentially for arenas, stadiums, and for teams. How did people buy tickets? In those days, people used to camp out and buy tickets at outlets, or they'd camp out at the box office. What people forget is in the late 70s, early 80s, 60 to 70% of all tickets that were sold at the box office. One of the earlier companies that was involved, that was the biggest name, was called Ticketron, a company I ultimately bought. But what they did was they were among the pioneers, and they would take allocations. And so you never quite knew. They would sometimes do the whole box office, and sometimes, or do all the inventory, and sometimes they would get allocations. So people never knew if they would get best available seat, because you'd sometimes go to an event and there'd be a section that had you'd see empty sections, and then you'd see a section with people, and you go, that's the Ticketron section. And when we started, what we told people was that it was necessary for us to have the whole house, because the whole premise in the early 80s was selling best available seat. Today that's obvious, but it was not so obvious in the early 80s. And that way, when people came to your outlets, even the designation, we called our outlets ticket centers as opposed to remote outlets. And we came up sort of with the theory that a remote outlet meant a remote seat, and you know, it's all marketing, all fun. Yeah, an allocation would be if there's, take a stadium that would hold 45,000 baseball tickets. You'd get an allocation of 5,000 tickets, maybe in 3 sections. We didn't do that, so we didn't face that. But that was the condition of the industry at the time we came in. And basically what we were was a processing center. I remember we went to one building in the Midwest, and I said, how do people buy tickets here? And he said, well, they buy tickets at the box office and at the outlets. And I said, does anybody use the phones here? And they said, no, nobody uses the phones. And I said, well, how? He said, we have very little phone business. And I said, well, how many lines do you have? And he said, well, just one. It comes in the box office. So you sit there and you maintain a straight face, and then, you know, when you wind up computerizing the building and you put all your equipment in, and then the public can walk into and have access to a 50-person phone room, sales go from, non-existent to 20 to 30% overnight, because ultimately it's about accessibility. I was practicing law in New York at that time, and this was a little company that had basically run out of money. But it struck me, there were 3 clients in Chicago. The Chicago White Sox, Jam, which is a major concert promoter, Arnie and Jerry, and the Chicago Cubs, who basically told us 3 conditions for them to become clients for Ticketmaster. One was that we would have a system up and running in Chicago by October 1st. 2 was we would tell them who our outlets would be by the summer. And 3 is we'd get the company financed. And I thought that was pretty interesting, that people were willing to sign a letter of intent and say, we would trust you to get the company financed, which told you the state of the industry. Because when you sat and talked to these people, obviously as a lawyer I thought I knew a lot more than I really did. And so the dynamic was that I was shocked or surprised that people would take that kind of a leap. And the reason they did was they felt they weren't taking that big a risk. They felt they were stepping off a curb. In those days, the business was driven by very low service charges and very low service. So nobody saw the ticket business as a real business. They saw it, the Ticketron mentality is, we're a utility. We don't do anything. We don't do any marketing. We don't help you sell tickets. We don't help you do anything except we put your tickets on sale, and if they sell, good for you, and if they don't, great. In terms of understanding the players in computerized ticketing, let me see if we can define it. A venue is defined as the facility that basically has the seats. That can be a stadium, that can be an arena, that can be a theater, that can be a club. So venue is the host. A promoter is somebody who sometimes owns a facility and sometimes doesn't, and they basically promote the act. So they promote whether it's rock and roll, whether it's country music, whether it's, you know, R&B, it doesn't really make any difference. That's the promoter's function. And the way the ticketing business worked in terms of who had ultimate authority, there was always the big battle of whose ticket is this? This is one of it was one of, not a controversy, but it was a lot of discussion was around whose ticket was it. It's the promoter's ticket or the building's ticket. In the end, if you had a building contract, that determined whether you had an exclusive on the building. So if you signed an exclusive contract with the venue, you had an exclusive contract with the building, whether or not you had a contract with the promoter. And that's the way it's worked before I got in the business. And there was logic to that, because ultimately everything in a business, everything in that venue is exclusive. Something people get confused with. There's one food service. There's one person that cleans it. There's one security company. I mean, everything in a building is driven by exclusives, and there was one exclusive ticketing company. And so that's sort of the generic basis of the business. What was interesting was, at the time you went into business, everybody complained. You know, there are moments in history when you know, there are books written. They're called tipping points. They're called sea change. At the time that we went into business, almost everybody complained about the service they got from Ticketron. And I remember when I negotiated some of those agreements, and they'd say, well, you know, I don't have, they'd take me and they'd show me old machines, or they showed me that they couldn't get software, or they showed me that they get paid once a month instead of once a week. There's a litany of things that, if I repeated them all, they're almost boring.
These are the outlets, I'm sorry?
No, these are the buildings. These are the venues. This is what the venues would tell you. They had equipment that was old. They had equipment that wouldn't work. They couldn't get it serviced properly. They couldn't get software changes. You could go down a list of things. And so what was interesting is that when I sat down and negotiated these deals, and I think I was probably a lot tougher at the beginning. As you get bigger, you find the bigger you become, the less tough you can be in terms of how you set things up. We were very tough at the beginning, which basically said we needed all it had to be exclusive. And if you wanted us to do a good job, we couldn't do this on $1 a ticket. And one of the things that we did was, and this is sort of where the business evolved to. When I got in the business, the buildings and the venues, paid a lot of money on the insides. And those were inside charges. So if you were paying a $10 ticket and there was a 4 or 5% inside charge, the building would net $9.50. Okay, 40 or 50 cents would come to the ticket company, and $1 would be charged to the public on the outside. Okay, and the building didn't share in that revenue. And I said, you know, that doesn't make any sense to me. People want convenience. People really do want convenience. So if you create an outlet system that's open store hours, if you create outlet systems that can generate a significant amount of tickets, if you can develop a system that will be reliable, that can do, well, when we started, if we could sell 20,000 tickets in 2 hours, we were doing great. By the time I left, you could do 20,000 tickets in 10 minutes. You know, the dynamics changed because of the throughput of what we were able to develop. But in the old days, it would take a full day to sell a concert like that. So if you sold it out in an hour and a half or 2 hours, that was great. And if you had 75 or 80 outlets that people could go to, it was really good. And the bet in the business was that you could make people not come to the box office and go to the outlets. Now, when you think about movies, movies are every 10 minutes from you. Who lives near a box office? I mean, how many people live around the Forum? How many people live around Madison Square Garden? How many people live around the United Center or the Rosemont Horizon? They're all different names now based on what they were called. But the dynamic was that you bet that if you could create the system It was Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And they did. And they would pay for the convenience, because here was the thought. If I drive to the box office, that's an hour. And then I got to drive back, that's an hour. And then I got to get online. Now, if I go to my local outlet and I can get my local ticket center and I can get those tickets, it's 15 minutes from my house. I've got as good a shot because I'm selling best available seat. Everybody's pulling from the same inventory. I got a better shot. And it worked. It really worked, in the sense that what we created by the mid-'80s was a perception that if Ticketmaster didn't sell the ticket, you were leaving money on the table. We created basically a process that said we make it really easy for the public to get tickets. Comes with a cost, but we make it really easy. And the public has a choice to go to the box office if they choose. And lo and behold, which led to a set of issues later on, was that no one went to the box office, which created the outcry of there's no box office. But the fact is, the only person, at the end, the only people who ever went to the box office were the scalpers, which was really pretty funny, because that's where they could line up and basically get tickets. But the dynamic was that the easier you made it, the more outlets you had, the more phone banks you had, people could get through. The very essence of scalping is, which most music writers never got, is that a ticket's a commodity. My favorite story about that is there were 5 Springsteen shows in L.A. and in the mid-'80s, and the tickets were $18. And we scrambled the first 10 rows so that while we were selling of every show, every show, we didn't sell front. You sold basically front to back from 11 on, and then you scrambled. Maybe it was the first 20 rows, and then 10 minutes into it, you'd release row 1, and 20 minutes, so you would do that. And there were a bunch of scalpers out in the valley, standing there, as we've all seen them. And this young girl walks out of the store. I think it was a Music Plus, and she's thrilled. She spent $18 and a $3 service charge, and and there's a guy standing there, and he says, "Where you sitting?" And she goes, "Second row, third night." And she is really excited. And he says, "I'll give you $200. How many tickets you have?" She had 4 was the limit. He says, "I'll give you $200 a ticket." We happened to have a spotter at this. We had spotters at different outlets, so we know this was a true story. So he says, "I'll give you $200 a ticket." She says, "No." He says, "I'll give you $500 a ticket." She says, "No." He says, $600 a ticket. She says, "No." He says, "Young lady, $750, my last and final offer. Yes or no?" And she took the money. She got $3,000 and got back online, and then I'm sure she complained about paying the service charge. But the reality is, that's the business. And what you see today is how that business has evolved is everybody's in the ticket business today. You buy tickets. I can't tell you how many schools I've been to where kids complained about service charge, and then I say, "How many of you put yourself through school by scalping tickets or by resale?" And quarter of the class's hand goes up. So it's kind of funny and kind of hypocritical, and it's led to eBay, and it's led to StubHub, and it's led to Tickets Now, and a whole host of basically resellers, because everybody's back in the business. Because here's the basic problem. In Broadway, a show will play as long as it can. And as long as it's making money, it plays. And there are, the house is scaled, and that means there are, tickets from $100 to $50 or whatever it is, and it's scaled. The problem with music is it's not that music isn't scaled. Nobody ever meets the demand. So the very essence of why tickets become the prices they do is the act isn't sitting there for 9 nights, the act is sitting there for 1 or 2 nights, maybe 3 nights, or maybe, it's a super act and it's there for 5 nights. But the fact is, when you multiply that, take a metropolitan marketplace like Los Angeles or New York, you're talking about 20 to 30 million people in a 2.5-hour radius, and you've got 150,000 seats, and it's a one-time event. The thing about the live business is its immediacy. It's something you want to touch. It's an experience you want to share. I call, when you go to a ball game or you go to a concert, you talk to strangers. You go with a friend, you go with a date, you go with your spouse, you go with whatever it may be. And you share that experience with them and with strangers. If you went to a restaurant and said to somebody sitting across the table, how'd you like that steak? They might think you lost your mind. But if you're sitting with somebody who makes a great catch, or you're holding a lighter, or you're swaying and you're holding hands, there's that remarkable emotional attachment that the live business has. And people fail to understand that there's one basic principle to life. Nobody ever paid more for a ticket than they wanted. This isn't life, this isn't housing, this is a business. And what you've seen with the artists is, as the artists have raised their prices and golden circles have come and you've seen higher prices for tickets, the artists recognize that they have a finite shelf life and they have careers. And, in the sense of, if you call them a commodity, they'd get upset. And I don't mean that, because they're extremely talented, extraordinary people. But they're surrounded by business people who are managers and agents and who understand that the people who participate in the secondary market don't provide any value to the artist. So when they see these prices going off the charts, they say, well, maybe we should have a golden circle, or maybe we should charge more into. I mean, when Jerry Buss raised the prices on the floor seats to $500, they were his tickets. He thought he'd lose people. Nobody left. Is seeing a concert worth less than seeing a Laker game if you're seeing a top flight performer? I don't think the answer is yes. I think they're worth the same, because it's an experience. And so, that's kind of the dynamic of it. I remember sitting in the early 80s with a bunch of promoters, and was sitting with a bunch of promoters and managers, and everybody's very upset because the first row was $18 or $20 and the last row was $18 or $20, and then they couldn't understand why people were buying tickets for $200 in the secondary market. And what the Golden Circle was saying, look, let's take X number of seats, and those are like loge seats or grants or orchestra seats, and let's price them and scale them. Basically, a Golden Circle is the beginning of scaling the house. As music evolved, as you went from $5 concert tickets in the 70s, $4 concert tickets in the 70s, until the mid-80s, because music is popular and the people's music, it was one price fits all. And that didn't work because, the fans who bought them, said, well, wait a minute, I paid $18 and now I can get $750, and so the artists started to look at it and say, maybe we should, then the business people, maybe we should get some of this money. And look, it's a business like anything else. You want to be fair to your fans. If you go to a baseball game or you go to a Laker game, the thing that Jerry Buss always did when I ran Ticketmaster, which was brilliant, was he had the 500 and then they became $1,000 floor seats. But he also had 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 seats up in the top that were $750 and $950. He said, listen, you can go. We get you in, but, and we'll get you a cheap price, but it's not going to be, it gets you in to share the experience. It's not the best seat. And music has come to that. And Broadway's come to that too, because you saw $500 tickets for the producers, and now they have this, like what they call Platinum Circle or whatever it's called. It's not surprising. And that's because you have a lot of people who don't want to stand online, who don't want to go through the hassle, and who want to get a ticket. And so it's never going to go away. When I left Ticketmaster in '98, the prices haven't gone to where they are now. Now, the problem here is because one act can get $150, another act thinks it can get $150. And the problem is not that people don't want to go, they just don't want to go to see that act at $150. Maybe it's $60 or $50, they would. And the problem is not every act can draw that kind of money. So, that's a different set of issues. But that was the beginning. That was when people started to think of this, maybe it's a business. Maybe it's something we have to look at. It used to be you made the record and toured to support the record, right? Now, I think what was Madonna's tour was $190 million, and the Stones are somewhere in that level. Now you tour to make money because pricing caught up to value, and the albums don't sell on the same level. It's a different dynamic. And then came merchandise, and then came, ancillary rights, and then came, all of this, none of which has anything to do with ticketing. But it was really the progression that when I got into business, people were genuinely concerned about being able to sell tickets orderly, have accurate accounting, not have duplicates, have a real straight-up business. And as we dealt with all those concerns, rapid speed of selling, you know, if you sell a show out quickly, you can roll into another show. And where you could do 3 or 4 or 5 stadium shows in a day, which was unheard of when I got in the business in the 80s, because you just couldn't physically get it done. And so the more the technology allowed you to do that, right, the more, you know, people started to take it for granted. You know, near the end, they assumed we had no technology because it all looked effortless. You know, the line was all you did is print a ticket. But people don't understand the issue of throughput, and they don't understand the issue of orderly distribution and making sure of, you know, the first big event we did was the White Sox. This is a true story. It was a White Sox game. And I remember I went to opening day of the White Sox in 1983, and I had a dream the night before that everybody was in the same seat and the system didn't work. So, you know, because I was never technical and I never learned the system. I understood the economics of the business, or I thought I did. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, you have to understand it was a lot of fun because you were changing rules and you were meeting needs. And from a manager's point of view and a band's point of view, if they could sell 3 shows instead of 2, that was good for them, right? And if you could do it orderly and not have counterfeits and not have duplicates, you could really make a better business. And, you know, that it ultimately helped everybody. Well, distribution is you'd have, you know, for some shows you'd have 100 operators and you'd have 100 outlets, 75 outlets in a big region. And so, and throughput was how fast you could print a ticket and do a transaction. So we could do 2,000 tickets a minute. And when you're talking about, you know, maybe in an 18,000 seat building, depending on the configuration, you might sell, in those days you'd probably sell 90% of the house, not taking account of band holds, sponsor holds, advertising holds, VIP holds, all those. If you could sell that out in less than an hour, you could sell them out in a half an hour. You know, that was unheard of. And so, gee, we're out in a half an hour. When do we roll? And, you know, it had an impact because what creating these systems do, what creating these systems did, facilitated concert buyers to get the tickets more rapidly, which led to more shows. Rolling over, in other words, so because you sold out so quickly, maybe you do a 3rd show in a market instead of a 2nd. When tours went on sale, going back 20 years, to go, well, we're going to do 2 dates here, 1 date here, and maybe 2 dates here, but we don't know, and then maybe 3 dates here, but we don't know, because we got to see what as they'd lay it out, and they'd leave room to move it from one city to another. And so if you sold out a show quickly and they rolled into a 2nd, then they knew they had 2 dates. And then a lot of these shows would go on sale the same day, and so you'd have a grid basically where you knew what was going on all over America. And you know, and you were in touch with the managers and the agents, and they would tell you whether to roll, and the buildings, and tell you whether to roll. In other words, go into the next show. I think the managers and agents and the buildings would make those decisions. We didn't make the decisions. We just gave them the information to make the decisions. One of the things that's great confusion, and which are basically, in my opinion, from a lot of the music writers, was that Ticketmaster is not involved in pricing of face value of tickets, not involved in determining whether shows, more than 1 or 2 shows, whether, how many shows go in a marketplace. The representatives of the band and the building, arena or the venue, make those decisions. We give them the information so that they have access. You go, well, let's see. First show, I've sold out all the tickets except maybe some singles and maybe 500 seats in the rafters. Well, you know from the business that you're going to sell those out because the closer you get to the date, people just buy them, because they want to be part of the experience. So maybe you roll into a second show. And then maybe you've cleaned up everything but maybe some singles and maybe 1,000 tickets in the second show. So, and you can see the demand on the phones, because remember, the reason people got busy signals, this is truly funny, the reason people got busy signals is you had 100 operators and hundreds of thousands of attempts. So the dynamic was, of course everybody couldn't get through. It was a pipe. It was an orderly pipe. And if you had 100 operators or even 200 operators, when you have, people learned about speed dialing and rotary, because rotary phones were disappearing. And so you'd sit there and you keep hammering it. And then if you got through, you could order 6 or 8 tickets. Now what's interesting is that today online for concerts, people will spend sometimes, and especially for theater, more time searching for good seats than they would on the phone. If they were on the phone for 10 or 15 minutes, they complained. But if they're sitting at their computer for a half hour, it's their time, so they can pick the show they want to go see, and they feel they're more in control of their own destiny as opposed to a third party. So all of that was going on in the 80s, and basically up until the mid-90s. And it was different because managers never got tools. They never knew, and the agents never got, how many tickets have we sold? Where are they? What's left? How do you figure it out? Where are you selling? Even in the basis that you could pull an outlet report online. So you'd say, now, where is my strength coming from? It's not coming from, if the show's in Indiana, it's not coming from, let's say, Los Angeles. We know that. Which are the strongest outlets? And you could look at that. And are there lines? And you'd call the outlets, and you'd speak to people in the outlets and say, do you have lines? We're out of the first show, and we still got 100 people, and you'd have polling, and you'd be figuring that out. And so I don't think anybody understood what we did. But I didn't think anybody needed to understand what we did. I think when I say the public didn't understand what was going on, I think the managers and agents got to use it, and I think it was helpful to them. They would have loved it if we had the system for free, but that wasn't. What happened was, we had a policy called cash only at the outlets, and you could use a credit card on the phones, and in those days, there were different service charges. Outlets were less than phones, which I understand has changed. My thinking at that time was that if you go to an outlet, you're making an overt effort to go somewhere. So that's, while a convenience, it's still different. The ultimate convenience is not leaving your house and calling on the phone. Now, what would happen is, and the reason it was cash only at the outlets was not because of any great technology issue, was that no band would pay the credit card. So the very essence of what happened was, and we felt too that, remember, as a ticket company, you're a guest in the department store. You're a guest in the music store. They don't want to spend all day with 200 people online. They want to get them in and get them out and get the tickets sold. So everybody can access cash. ATMs are near every store, and so, or near every department store, and people knew that, and so that wasn't an issue. And basically, what happened over the years is that the inside charge went from, put this way, went from significant to minimal, and the outside charge went from minimal to significant. And in a lot of these cases, even today, when people go, well, Ticketmaster's not reasonable, they're not cutting this, I'm trying to lower the price of the tickets, but Ticketmaster's not being reasonable, it's sort of disingenuous, because what they're saying is Ticketmaster's cut is always the same. It's 15 to 20% of the face value of the ticket up to a certain price. It's not 15 or 20% of $100. But what happens is, where you get these 30 and 40% service charges, the problem that you have is that everybody's participating. So if one group, if a promoter says, I want to lower the service charge, I want you to lower the service charge, he means you take it out of your pocket, and I don't want to lose it out of mine. The music business and this business was all driven by the following axiom. What's mine is mine, what's yours we'll negotiate for. And so everything was, I think your service charges are too high, leave my rebate in place, but you lower your charge. And my premise when I built the business was, look, I'll provide all the services that you need, I'll provide the back room, I'll even take the heat, which I did. I mean, we were the catalyst and the lightning rod for the heat when these charges got high. But the very essence is that all the charges weren't ours. And we took the heat for the industry, for the arenas and the venues, and we took the heat for many of the promoters. Because ultimately, promoters would say, I gave away too much on the show, can you help me? Okay, how much do you need? Can we add $2 a ticket? Can we add 50 cents a ticket? Can we add $1 a ticket? Not to the face value, but to the service charge.
On top of your markup.
On top of the markup. And so it sort of evolved like that. And of course, we took the heat, and the great funny comments you'd make is a promoter or a building, a music reporter would say to them, how come Ticketmaster service charges were higher for this concert than the others? And invariably, the client would say, I don't know. I got to look into this. This is those guys. You got to really keep an eye on them. So here you have the public saying this, right? For public consumption, and then the other side, which no one ever got really connected, was we never lost a client. And the reason you never lost a client is that was the solar system that was created. So the very essence was, if you overpaid for an act, the one part of the ticket that the act couldn't control was the service charge. That was the dynamic. Neither good nor bad, just a fact of life. It was a business. And you were there to take the heat. And so, I'm sure we'll get into that later, but the dynamic behind all of that was who had control of the money. That was the real issue underneath all of this. And what ultimately happened was, as new buildings got built and new arenas got built, and as the acts got smarter and their representation got smarter, where you went from 60-40 deals between the act and the promoter, and you pay the rent, fair rent, they went to 70-30, then 80-20, then 95-5, then none, then a fee. So basically, all of this happened. These things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen where the act says, I'll take all the money, or I'll take most of the money, and you have the risk. And then the promoter in the building, the representation of the acts is very good, and you've got multiple buildings and cities bidding for an act. So they say, if you want me to play in your building, I'm going to cap your rent at $10,000. The guy's giving up 20. He knows what it costs to open the door. He's got debt service. He's got to build this. So in the end, all of this gets passed along to the public. And my view was, and let's go back to this, nobody paid more for a ticket than they wanted to. So when you would read some of those crazy headlines and go, Ticketmaster's charging 50% for a ticket. Yeah, it was a $3 ticket with a $1.50 service charge. I mean, it was crazy stuff. It wasn't like you had a $50 ticket and a $25 service charge. It was more driven by moments of, the smaller tickets we had very low service charges for, but as a percentage they were high, right? And after I left in, when I sold the company in '98 and I left, the service charges have gotten significantly higher than from when I was there. And, that's the nature of the business. But it's a business underneath all of this, and the creation underneath this was driven by the fact, and this is something to think about. Our clients were the venues and the promoters. We served the public, but our clients were the venues and the promoters. And people assumed that Ticketmaster served the public, and you could go through a process where you'd go, we weren't warm and fuzzy as a company. But the real reality is this: half of what you sell people don't want to sit in if they had a choice. You're selling the back half of the house. And in some cases, not some cases, in every case in a sellout, you're selling the last third of the house. And after you've been selling the last third of the house for a long time, people aren't going to like you. If you buy a tie or a shirt or a pair of sneakers and they're new, you're going to get the same quality and the same content and whatever that is. Any commodity, you buy a plate, you buy glass, whatever it is, it's the same. A ticket is moves. You buy a ticket on an airline, it doesn't make a difference if you sit in the first row coach or the last row coach. Buy a ticket at a concert, it makes a difference if you sit in the first row or you sit in the last row. So there's huge emotion attached to the process. Huge. And most people don't come to this thoughtfully or think that out in terms of understanding the dynamic that goes with that as a business. In other words, to really understand, there are companies like Coke, there are companies like Microsoft, there are companies, when you read the top 10 companies, brands that America loves, well, they're selling the same thing. When you have that Coke, it's it's terrific, you know. Microsoft's giving you a product. Take whatever product you want. It's consistent. What Ticketmaster gives you is a service. It doesn't give you the same product because the seat moves. You can't put 10,000 people in the same seat or in the first 3 rows unless you have a row that's 12 miles long. Doesn't work like that. So you have to understand what you are. And interestingly enough, when we went into e-commerce and that evolved, and we get into advertising later, the truth is, and it's the same today, Ticketmaster is not a company that's going to be liked, but it will be trusted. And trusted in the following sense. You're giving them your credit card. They know they will get their product, which is a ticket. And no matter where it is, they know that ticket will be good. So Ticketmaster was an early e-commerce mover, which we can discuss later. And the reason it happened was because people ultimately people really trusted us because they knew we were very careful with the information we had. I can't tell you honestly that when it first started that I handled it very well because I didn't understand it. And I didn't come to it, and this was way before the controversies with the government, I mean just in general here. My theory was that music writers don't understand business. So the very essence of what you paid for, they always thought there was some evil thing attached to people paying a lot of money for a ticket or a service charge for a ticket. And they didn't understand the economics. And Ticketmaster got treated differently after it went public because people saw it as a business, and you had business writers writing about it as opposed to music writers who were always on some crusade. And look, let's face it, what was Ticketmaster? Ticketmaster was a back room. It was the gateway. If you're not versed in terms of understanding law, it's easy to call it a monopoly, although it doesn't fit any definition of a monopoly because it doesn't own anything. It's an agent. It's an agency. So, one of my lines used to be to these guys is, I have 7 buildings as the major buildings in a city. If I lose 2, am I still a monopoly? I mean, here's the point. Your contracts come up 3 to 5 years. They're always rolling. You always have 15 to 20% of your contracts coming up every year. So the very essence of that makes it impossible to think you have a stranglehold on the business. And the problem here is businesses were no more going to have multiple ticketing companies in their building than you'd have multiple operating systems in your computer. It's insane. There's one inventory control system. And we were very careful and calculating to make it a closed system, closed architectural system. Other ticket companies wanted to use our distribution system, and I wouldn't let them. And because my thought was, you either buy the whole package or don't buy anything. And by the way, that's totally legal. Music writers didn't understand that. Just did not understand it. Didn't understand the dynamic that if you didn't sell all, you didn't have to sell any. Very basic premise. Because in the end, if you want to sell best available seat, you're in the marketing business. You're in a marketing business that says to your clients, if I have all your inventory, people have to believe in the integrity that when they show up, they can get the best of what's there. Now, that may be the last 10 rows, but that's there. Let me give you a story that sort of goes underneath this, which is very funny. To me, anyway. We were not giving out seat locations for Broadway. And we... am I okay?
Yeah. If you lean forward,
okay, I won't lean forward.
You can lean forward.
We were selling tickets for Broadway, and we'd say best available seat, and we didn't give out seat locations. Well, where the press consistently ripped us was Denver. And I always blamed it, on the lack of oxygen there. I mean, the air was lighter. And I finally said I couldn't take it anymore. Broadway in Denver's a couple months. So why don't we give out seat locations, and let's see what happens, okay? And lo and behold, here was the sea change. If I said to you, best available seat, and put you in the last row of the orchestra, because remember, outside New York, almost everything's limited run. It's not like we play until we run out. We play for 2 weeks here, and then we go to another city, because Broadway touring is limited. So if I put you in the last row of the orchestra on Tuesday night, you leave that meeting, and you say, or that play, and you go, they ripped us off. They said best available seat, and it's the last row in the orchestra we got taken advantage of. Giving out seat locations, said we have no seats left in the orchestra. The only seats we have is the last row. Do you still want them? Because the theory was that people wouldn't buy the last row or the last rows in the orchestra. And here's what we found. Most people, 90 to 95% of people, must go to theater in these limited runs based on the day they have. Not multiple times. Same in Broadway, too. If I want to go Tuesday night, I got to go Tuesday night the 5th. I can't go on, okay? So they said, wow, we were lucky. We got the last seats in the orchestra. So you went from being, I've taken advantage of you, to you gave me a service and all the noise went away, and then we took that and we went to New York. Now, that's Broadway. The big complaint that was always about Ticketmaster was the heat. Was in connection with the topic, was service charges. And the public, here was the great disconnect in life. The writers would tell you that you're taking advantage of the public. The public never stopped buying tickets. As a matter of fact, during the heat and the publicity, you did better as a company, which made no sense to me, by the way, which sort of proved the axiom, I don't care what you write about me, just as long as you're writing. We would internalize it because we wanted people to think well of us, or we wanted people certainly not to think that we're taking advantage of them. But the fact of the matter was that it had no impact on your business, other than you took the heat for everybody. And I remember I was at a college a couple of years ago, and I go, who do you think's responsible for the price of tickets? And I said, how many people think it's the building? And a few people raised their hand. And I said, how many people think it's the promoter? And a few people. And how many people think it's the act? Nobody raised their hand. How many people think it was Ticketmaster? And everybody raised their hand. And it shows you how bizarre the process is, because no one thinks that the act has anything to do with their own destiny. Okay? And that's the process. That's the part that's really interesting. And then after a while, like anything else, you kind of develop an outer shell that kind of says, okay, they're going to say that. There's nothing you can do. And who do I really care about? I care about my clients, which are the promoters and the venues. The reason all this is happening is because I'm taking the heat for them. And so in that scope, there was no, what the music writers and the people who wrote the really horrendous stuff about it, and in many cases were really personal attacks on me, I was an easy focal point. I wasn't from the industry. I came from the outside. I came with a really clear idea of what I wanted to do, and every year it got clearer. You didn't, the joke in 1993 that you knew all this in 1983 is silly. You learn every year from the year before, and you kind of evolve. But what's interesting was that none of my clients complained. So you'd read this, and then you'd say, okay, so let me see, what's the fallout from this, right? I mean, we all have seen consumer products where bad things happen and sales fall apart. So they write these terrible stories, and they go, your service charges are too high, and you're taking advantage, and they use a lot stronger words than that. And the only thing that happens to your business is it continues to grow. In the 80s, until we sold the company, Pritzkers were my partner, and until we sold, they were from Chicago, and Jay was my mentor. And until we first sold the business in 1993 to Paul Allen, from 1985 to 1983, our business grew at the rate of 35 to 55% a year. So here, on the left hand, you got heat. Here on the right hand, you're getting more buildings. You never got heat from your buildings because they understood the dynamic, and they understood that it was all caused by the greed of the acts. In other words, we had a solar system where we all shared. As promoters got squeezed and buildings got squeezed, they said, we need to find it. And the controversy we had in many cases with the acts was this was a revenue stream they couldn't control. Do I think they understood I took the heat? Absolutely. I was on the phone with somebody today who said, you took the heat for the whole industry. Now, do I think they appreciate it? I think they were human. Some did and some didn't. Again, it was like, what can you do for me today? But I understood that. I never had false illusions about this business, which is why when I left it in '98, I never came back to it. The truth was, it was a great business. It was a lot of fun, and you had a chance to create a solar system that had never been done before. In the early '80s, I remember people had the same kind of one service charge in the marketplace. And I go, why one service charge? You have different price tickets. And I remember we were having an argument. We were having a discussion. Not an argument, but a discussion with the team. And the team said, I said, why is the service charge $1 on a $40 ticket? And they said, well, because we have a $5 ticket. I said, okay, so make the $5 ticket $1 and make the $40 ticket $2. Well, you can't do that. And I remember my line, I said, was that the tablet Moses dropped? I mean, why can't you do it? It's a business. The guy who's buying a $40 ticket don't care about the $5 ticket. He ain't, and that was the high price ticket in those days. He's not going to sit with a guy with $5 is going to play. And I went back to the guys who devised our system, and I said, we need to have multiple service charges on the same event. They said, we don't do that. And I said, what do you mean we don't do that? Of course we're going to do that. And so multiple service charges on the same event, multiple service charges in a marketplace, the ability to make a dynamic, flexible ticketing system that could be responsive to its clients' needs. All of that was hard to imagine in 2006 sensibilities, but all of that was radical in those days. And all of that was monumental change. And the business plan we wrote was New York, Chicago, and LA was supposed to be 5 years down the road. And the fact of the matter was, we couldn't really get arrested in New York. We did Chicago based on the story I told you before. And we went out to LA totally by a fluke. And it's worth telling the story only because this is what happened. John Ruby, who worked for Barry Fay, called me up and said, do you want to do the US Festival? Steve Wozniak is doing the US Festival. And I said, what's an US Festival? I mean, He said, well, basically they're doing these weekends out in Glen Helen Regional Park. We think it's going to be 1 million tickets. Do you want to do this because everybody hates Ticketron? And would you consider doing this? But you have to guarantee the drop count. Honest to God, I didn't know what the drop count was, so of course I guaranteed it. And because to me it was, well, the ticket hit the floor. That's a drop. But there were so many counterfeits with Ticketron that what they were really saying is, every ticket we count, you pay for. Okay? Now, that said, in March of 83, because this conversation was the end of 82. In March of 83, a bunch of us come out to LA, February and March. We signed 2 leases on an office, one for 6 months and one for 5 years, because nobody knew it would work. We had no idea if this would work. We put up 50 grand for the offices for 6 months and had the right to leave. We found an office that was that had a data center of a company that went out of business on Mid-Wilshire in Koreatown, okay? I mean, 3325 Wilshire Avenue, Wilshire Boulevard. And we opened up and did the US Festival, and none of us knew anything. I mean, wow. And so, because, if you're from New York, you don't know anything about LA. LA is this big amorphous place, and, you just didn't know. And I didn't know anybody out here. I knew 2 people out here when I came out here. And 6 months later, we wound up having signed contracts with Avalon, the major concert promoter, Long Beach, the Hollywood Bowl, Philharmonic, and the Forum. And then we were in business. All because of a phone call from a guy who said, do you want to do this? And life is serendipity. It's like when you see these kids in the internet, they started this thing in their garage. Life is a matter of seizing moments, and you never know where those moments lead. And we came out here, and that was really the start of the business. Because even though we were in Chicago, we were losing a lot of money. And this company, if it did not go to Los Angeles, probably would have failed. Well, what we did was at the beginning of starting when we started getting into business, one of the things I did, as much by accident as by, by design, in these negotiations, I said to people, you have to put your logos in, you have to put our logo, the Ticketmaster logo, in your ads. And you have to mention our name on radio or television, put in logo slicks or whatever it was. And people said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, look, if that's advertising, so if you want that, you have to pay for it. And I said, I am. They said, what do you mean? I said, you have a piece of every ticket I sell. It's in your interest to put my name, or Ticketmaster's name, not Fred's name, but the company's name, in your ads. That was unheard of in those days, too. Now, as a result of that, when I left, Ticketmaster's name was probably being mentioned 15 to 20,000 times a day in America. Everybody's seen their logo slicks in the, and seen their logo in ads. And our marketing budget in those days was zero. So you got the benefit of having all of that because people understood that people don't want a contest of where to find your outlets. People don't want to really search to find your phone number. So by creating that and then through repetition, the key to selling tickets is repetition. The key to change is people only go to the outlet once if they don't have the tickets. So if I've been buying tickets at Music Store A, and for the let's take the Staples Center, and I go to Music Store A and they go, oh, we don't have that anymore. That's the beauty of exclusive. You find out, well, who sells the tickets? It's Music Store B. You never go back to Music Store A. Changing people's buying patterns are really simple. Today, it's even simpler because phone numbers are easy to change, and the web is the web. You can go figure it out. But in those days, I remember some of the questions we would get was, when we were in the Midwest, they said, Ticketron has an asynchronous power supply, so if there's a power outage, their machines will still be up. And you go, okay, but they'll be in a store that's on Illinois power, so how's that going to help you? So while there's no light in the rest of the store, you're going to go buy a ticket? Do you hear what you're saying? And they'd look at you and they couldn't understand what you were saying. Because in the end, it made no difference if the machine was on, if everything was dark around you, right? So what we try to do is we sort of debunk myths, which basically said, look, tickets are sold regionally, it's a local business, deal with the business for what it is, and changing people's buying pattern, the key to changing people's buying pattern is consistency and then repetition. If I go to Music Plus, which was the store we used here, or the May Company, what hours are the outlets? What hours is the ticket center open? It's open store hours. So if the store's open from 9 to 9, we sell tickets from 9 to 9. Now the stores staffed the ticket counters. We didn't. That was part of the deal. But if you go back to the guys before us, maybe they'd only be open from 12 to 5. Maybe they wouldn't be open on the first day of sale. Everything came with restrictions. And what we did when we got into business was we standardized a lot of this, that the public never understood that we had done that. We just made it more consistent. And the public got into it because it was easy. Fundamentally, my job was to make things as easy as give the public every chance they could to buy a ticket. Not at a reason, not at a price, not for free, and not necessarily as low as the public wanted to pay. But we go back to the dynamic of, to provide that service and provide that convenience, it came with a cost, a fair cost. And, clearly the public embraced it because you saw your numbers increase every year. What's interesting is I didn't invent outlets. Outlets were there prior to, because that's, even when you had hard tickets before computers, tickets were bicycled out to outlets and there was hard tickets. So outlets were nothing new. And from what I understand today, although I don't know that this is necessarily right, outlet sales have clearly gone down in terms of, with the internet, in terms of what's happened. But phone sales have declined even more dramatically. So outlets still play a portion for certain kinds of acts and family shows, for people that don't have credit cards, for people that aren't comfortable with the web. But if you take theater, it's mostly the web. If you take concerts, it's probably some outlets in the web. Phones have generally gone away. That's the part that's interesting. When we when you know, I think at one point I had 11 phone rooms and 2,500 operators, and I think now there's 2 or 3. I'm not even sure. But the very essence is the internet made that easy for people to deal with and not call. And so, you know, that's just sort of the natural evolution of things. I was very careful about going into that because I felt that we would be the first guys to get picked on by, you know, by the guys who love to create havoc on the web. But the truth was that we had a brand name. As you evolved, I think, you know, in a demographic of 15 to 40, everybody knew Ticketmaster's name. We were among the first to do e-commerce. And I remember a guy walks in my office. His name was Bob Perkins, and Bob Perkins walks in my office, and he says, "We sold our first ticket on the internet today." Because we were on it 6 months doing information and guides and stuff, but no commerce. And then I said, okay, we'll turn it on, we'll try it, we'll do it up in Seattle. And we sold 1 ticket. And Bob Perkins came in my office and said, "We sold 1 ticket on the internet." And I said, my initial reaction was great. The internet was invented by people that didn't get to go to the prom, and this is their revenge. And I said, call up the guy and find out why he did it. And he walks in my office and he starts laughing and he says to me, this is what the guy said: "I don't like talking to people and I don't like talking to you." And that was the conversation. And that sort of reinforced my view of the business. Now, the first month we did $100,000 on the web with no promotion, no advertising. 100,000 of ticket sales. The second month we did $1 million. The third month we did $2 million. Then I knew we had something. I knew we had something really amazing. But I was leaving 3 months later. So for me, I remember one of the early adaptations, you know, because people say, well, why should we pay service charges on the web? One of the big issues. Things are free. Well, tickets aren't free. Tickets aren't discounted. Ticketmaster doesn't own the plane. You know, what they own is the service, right? And so somebody came in and said, everything is free on the web, you know? So we should just do free on the web. And I said, fine, then your salary this week will be free too. Because how are you going to get paid? And I remember I gave a speech at one of the Jupiter conferences, and I said, you know, it's all great that everybody's doing all this stuff for free. I only have one question. Who's paying somebody? This is a business. People need to be paid to do this. And Ticketmaster's success in this does not surprise me at all, because we would have gotten there anyway. I mean, the fact of the matter is that was the road. The pricing paradigm they have is the one I created. And it was that people pay for a service. And it hasn't changed. And, you know, what people have to realize is the buildings aren't interested, the arenas aren't interested in changing that. The promoters aren't interested in changing that. What people want is the ability to have access. That's what this is about. We provide you access. No one sees all the work that's done to make those sites viral, that allow you to take credit cards, that allow you to scan all these different buildings, see where you're sitting, see what's going on. You know, it's something that people don't appreciate or give any value to. And when you look at the margins at the end of the day, no one's running at ridiculous margins. So in the end of the day, it's expensive to deliver the service, and it's expensive to pay for the service. So, but it all balances out, and you know, it's the way it works. The answer is I don't know. But I use a word called willfulness, perseverance. An entrepreneur I define as somebody sitting up in a tree, high on a branch, sawing the branch, facing the tree. So you're going to fall. The question is how many times you're going to get up. And, you know, is the last time you fall, you give up? Or do you finally say, you know, the difference between success and failure is very small. It's finite. I told you stories here of how at the beginning of Ticketmaster, it could have failed. I believe that it's a combination of desire, talent, willfulness, luck, determination, insecurity, and I can't quantify the doses of each. I think there are two things you need to know when you look at successful entrepreneurs. One is in the second grade, they all failed plays well with others. Because the very essence of being an entrepreneur means you're listening to your own music. And the second thing is a monumental fear of failing, which is a driving force in terms of how you do things. It's not like you wake up every day and say, I don't want to fail. But in moments of great introspection, in moments when you're truly alone, in moments when everybody is either against you or thinks what you're doing is wrong and you are the only one that sees that clarity, that's what it takes when you form these things. When organisms are small, they're all on life support. They all are threatened because any single event can kill them. Nothing can hurt any of these big companies today, really. You know, they have moments and blips, and sometimes it goes up and sometimes it goes down, but the corpus is so strong, the organism itself is so strong, that you can't do anything to it. And I described Ticketmaster success sort of, it was like a train. And, you know, the first year or two is like you're trying to chug your way uphill and get uphill, and you're pedaling really hard, you're not getting anywhere. It's like a gerbil wheel, you know, it's like you're just banging along and you're batting your head again. People don't know what to make of you, and you don't know what to make of yourself, and you're not quite sure what the whole scope is. And then you get to where it's level, where you're meeting payroll and you're doing business and you're getting a few little wins, and, you know, the train's moving up and picking up speed and everything's fine, and you're just beginning to feel good about yourself, that maybe you are actually right, because you're going to sleep every night going, I think I'm going to kill myself. I mean, basically, because you're saying, I can't believe how hard this is. You know, it's just a huge undertaking, and you are, I call it life in a barrel. Nothing exists on any side of you. You wake up in the morning thinking about the business, and you go to sleep at night thinking about the business, and there's no room for anything else. It's sheer determination, sheer willfulness, sheer force of personality, sheer focus that you live. I mean, when you think of things that we used to do, which is neither good nor bad, just that we did them, is that in this compelling moment, when I came to this town, I would count logos in the Sunday calendar section. How many are mine? How many were theirs? And my belief was, I woke up every day and every weekend, and my goal was to see only our logo. Now, I once gave a really ridiculous quote that my goal is to sell every ticket in America. It sounded good, it was funny, and it played into a piece, but you knew you couldn't do that. And so what you had was this sheer drive to build something. And you wanted to be, you went from, look, they're big, but, there's room for two big ticket companies, to maybe there should only be one, maybe we should be the biggest. And then I remember when we bought Ticketron, and what most people miss when we bought that was Ticketron was broke, was in their client accounts, which is the money that you collect for the client, that you pay them every week for their weekly sales. So basically, when we closed that deal, they basically wrote us a check to bring everything back to normal. And what I thought about the morning after, I'll never forget the morning I woke up after I bought them. Because there were just really, was very little that was left, and the Schuberts wound up buying the system, and I bought a bunch of contracts. Was for so many years, I woke up with the focus of a dragon, it's this motivation, let's go do this. And I remember I woke up the next morning, I didn't know what to do. And what I did was, for a couple of weeks, I couldn't get myself focused to figure out where the next challenge came. Because entrepreneurs always want to challenge themselves. They're always looking to go to a different level and get excited about that.